Hello, welcome. This talk is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication here at the Yale School of the Environment. The Center for Environmental Communication, or YCEC for short, focuses on four areas. We conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behavior. We teach students and train working professionals. We convene a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners. And finally, we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, including Yale Climate Connections, a climate-focused news service that engages many thousands of people every day and includes a short daily radio story that airs on more than 750 stations nationwide. If your organization is looking for support in addressing climate disinformation and misinformation, please reach out to our partnerships team at ypccc.partners@yale.edu, and I will send you that email address in the follow-up email, so no need to scramble to write that down. The chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send us your questions for the speakers, and please upvote your favorite questions you see there from others, and we will prioritize getting to those. We're going to make a recording of this conversation available on our website, and we will send a link to everyone who registered. Today's talk will be moderated by Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz, Director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and the Josh Annie Tom Catt Professor of Climate Communication at the Yale School of the Environment. Tony, I hand it to you.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So welcome, everybody. Good day. So we've got a great lineup today to talk about the role of climate and mis and disinformation in global action on climate change, or inaction on climate change. So I'm just going to provide a little context before we get to our guest speakers. So first of all, it's just important to recognize that mis and disinformation campaigns are not new. They date back to the earliest days of civilization, and they've long played a role in acquiring, maintaining, or overthrowing power. That's often been their purpose. Mis and disinformation about climate change science specifically, and in particular here in the United States, also dates back decades. And it drew heavily on the strategies of the tobacco industry. As many of you know, doubt is our product. It was one of the critical strategies that was first developed by the tobacco industry that was grafted right into the climate change debate and continues to be one of their dominant strategies to this day. In recent years, climate change disinformation has also now become just one of multiple fronts in larger political and cultural struggles. So it's no longer simply about slowing or blocking climate action, though that is clearly still an important goal for many people promoting this stuff. But it's now increasingly been weaponized as part of larger political and cultural struggles. I'd also say that so far, and our research shows this around, our global scale research shows that so far organized climate denial has been primarily limited to the United States, Canada, Australia, and to a lesser extent in the UK. But this is changing fast as the world continues fitfully to implement climate policies, as translation tools improve, and as communication platforms have gone global. Just think about WhatsApp or TikTok and so on. Like, misinformation that may start in one place is not limited to that one place anymore. So disinformation strategies and tactics have also now metastasized into other issues like COVID denial or election denial, and across, of course, all these new communication systems that we're all struggling to keep up with. But many of the false claims, the core strategies, and the tactics of climate change mis and disinformation remain the same. We often see the same zombie false claims coming back again and again. So just because you've debunked the myth that, you know, the sun or that climate change is caused by volcanoes, just to pick one, it doesn't matter in the end because it keeps coming back and keeps coming back and keeps coming back. And so we just have to recognize that there is no one simple tactic or solution that's going to solve this forever. These are like zombies. They're incredibly difficult to kill, and they want more brains. So this is and in fact, of course, what you see there is there's no scientific consensus claims. Climate change isn't real, still out there. it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem, and you even still hear the claim that it'll be good for us. Like, don't we all like to be warm? Isn't CO2 plant food? Like these false claims, even though they were debunked literally decades ago, still continue to circulate today. And it's now, of course, expanded to attack and undermine the solutions to climate change. So it's no longer just about climate science. It's also now increasingly about the solutions to this problem. So this is a big and sprawling topic. We're only going to get to begin to address it in today's webinar, but we're really fortunate to have 3 speakers today who are going to introduce us to the challenge of climate change disinformation as it exists today and where it's going, and also provide some solutions that you should be thinking about. So we're going to start with Phil Newell. So Phil, I'm going to introduce you and turn it over to you. Phil's the communications co-chair of Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition and an information integrity specialist focused on corporate climate propaganda for the Global Strategic Communications Council. Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much. Really honored to be here today. So first off, what am I talking about when I talk about propaganda, misinformation, and climate disinformation? Propaganda, any political message that gets repeated, basically. I'm a simple guy. These are my simple working definitions. Misinformation, then, is something that's wrong. There's one objective reality. We all have to share it, but an infinite number of ways to be wrong about it. And people seem bound and determined to find every single one. Disinformation, then, I describe as wrong on purpose for money, which makes it commercial speech, which isn't as protected by the First Amendment because false advertising is illegal, actually. Then climate disinformation is wrong about climate change on purpose for money. Pretty straightforward for me, a simple working man, ask a PhD, though, and you'll get something decidedly more complicated. Here are 2 graphics from 2 key studies on climate disinfo. One breaks them down into 5 main claims with dozens of subclaims and even more sub-subclaims like Tony was just talking about. And then another one there on the discourses of delay that again have become more popular as the deniers have had to fight climate policies instead of climate science. As you can see, lots of ways to be wrong. Graphika, I think, will tell us more about the narratives in the next presentation. Still on definitions, advocates somewhere in the middle. CAD's definition here, false content that misrepresents climate science, undercuts the need for climate action, or greenwashes fake solutions that don't really solve the problem. Policymakers have a relatively similar definition, as we can see here from the European Commission. And so between all of them, we can see generally there's some consensus. Climate disinformation is wrong. It's spread to weaken the public will for climate action. Wrong about climate change on purpose for money. So climate disinfo, where does it come from? Wrong question. I often hear disinfo being described as though it's like a naturally occurring phenomenon, a fog that sweeps in on little cat feet, or as an active subject with agency like a living thinking person. But it's not. It's a tool. It's a passive object the powerful use to maintain the status quo. And that's who we need to focus on. So the better question is, who is it coming from? After all, lies don't spread themselves. They need people. And although climate policy is broadly popular, there is an active opposition who gets plenty of help from big carbon, which spends something like $800 million a year on the climate counter movement. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly through disinformation subsidies, for example, creating and spreading the misleading videos and social media posts that get people mad at something as innocuous as offshore wind turbines. So here you see a map of just part of the network of groups fighting against offshore wind from a study out of Brown University's Climate Social Science Network. Shows the ecosystem of lobby groups and disinfluencers and anti-wind coalitions and how they all sort of share personnel and funding and attention and work together. And while traditionally industry could use its money to set up front groups that pose as grassroots, at this point they're also finding where these groups these locals are congregating online and then moving in to empower them, for example, by saying, oh, here are some lawyers you can use to challenge the projects. So industry creates and spreads disinformation as fertilizer to grow these little grassroots online groups into a thriving political opposition. But it's not organic grassroots, it's corporate fed propaganda and disinformation. It's industrial astroturf. It's the same story in the media. Instead of playing fair in mainstream media, where fact-checking keeps lies to a minimum, polluters and propagandists set up alternatives. Take the 3 dailies, for example, Daily Caller, Daily Wire, Daily Signal. In 1 year, Daily Caller got nearly 40% of its revenue from Koch sources, one of the biggest fossil funders of disinfo, who are also behind the heritage incubated Daily Signal, while a different fracking fortune entirely blessed the Daily Wire and PragerU with over $10 million. Then there's Breitbart, which got $10 million from the Mercers, and Tenet Media, a podcasting crew that got $10 million from Russia, according to the Department of Justice. So if you have $10 million, you can set up fake news sites. But can you grow them? Maybe not without some help from your friends. Specifically, Facebook. 2009, Mark Zuckerberg hired Joel Kaplan, and Facebook's been a climate disinformation and right-wing propaganda machine ever since. Why? Because, as deeply reported by Wired, in a piece you should definitely go read and not just take my very quick word on, Joel Kaplan repeatedly gave out get out of Facebook jail free card to those disinfo sites because they're all on the same team, and he was happy to help them spread their billionaire-backed disinformation. Elsewhere online, it's the same story. This is great research from Media Matters, caused quite a stir. But I think I saw something that I think a lot of people missed in the punditry crush of like, oh, look how popular these misogynistic bros are. Like, we should be more like them. No. Almost half those big red bubbles aren't organic demand-driven podcasts responding to what people want. They're billionaire-backed propagandists. Because Big Carbon and other billionaire dark money built up. Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, Dennis Prager, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Tom Fitton, Dan Boygina, Dinesh D'Souza, and Steven Crowder. It's 11 of the bubbles. Another 3 come straight from Fox News. And then there are the Russian propagandists. So the graphic isn't a representation of demand, of what people want. It's of supply, of the infrastructure to spread disinformation and propaganda. It's not that podcast listeners and by proxy the general public really crave hate and disinfo and Russian propaganda, and that's what we should give them. It's that if you have $10 million to spend on propaganda and you can game social media platforms, you can build an audience. And with that audience, thanks to social media, you can start to really reshape reality. Because so much of our interaction with the world is now through the internet, social media shapes how we experience reality. For example, Graphika used to be able to show pretty stark differences between far-right accounts and climate deniers and then regular conservatives more broadly. But through the billionaire-backed anti-ESG campaign, those disinfluencers have very deliberately collapsed those distinctions to the point that computationally speaking, climate deniers are indistinguishable from the right-wing culture wars influencers. That's a problem, because social media distorts how we think about the world. One study calls it a funhouse mirror factory, as social media exposes users to disinfo that we interpreted as representative of a lot of people, popular beliefs. But because just a relative handful of people post the majority of the content, the CCDH once finding 10 publishers were behind 69% of Facebook's climate denial, it distorts our image of public opinion, like a funhouse mirror warps our image of ourselves. Another study calls this a false social reality, and it's got a great graph here that's both my most and least favorite of all time because it makes no sense at first, but once you get it, you can see the impact of disinfo. So if I were to ask you how many Americans support a Green New Deal, what would you say? It's basically what this study did. The results are the violin plots with the red line showing that something like 65–70% of Americans support a Green New Deal and a carbon tax and all these other issues. But everybody thinks it's only 25% or 50% of the population that supports it. So that's the violin shape that you see there. So if a majority of Americans support climate policy, then it's the deniers and the politicians blocking climate action who are out of touch with public sentiment, not activists calling for a Green New Deal. And if a majority of us support climate policy, then the polarization actually plays in our favor. There's more of us than there are of them. Disinformation isn't used to make you think you're wrong. It's used to make us think we're alone. So what can we do about it? For starters, we can put out more information, which we will hear more about in the panel. Inoculations, debunkings, through any and all mass media venues can be really effective at addressing misinformation and helping keep people informed. But only those who want to be informed. And while I very much believe in the importance of fact-checking and recognize the value of inoculations for misinfo, they're not going to stop industrial disinformation. Those zombie myths keep coming back. Because providing more good info only works with people who want good info. But not everybody wants to be correct. That's who we have to stop. Disinformation isn't like the medical world, where finding patient 0 for an outbreak is important to stopping it. We can't just find the person who first posted disinfo online and let them know they're wrong, and then they'll stop spreading it. Even from the medical world, we know this information deficit-based treatment doesn't work. Typhoid Mary is the example. Back to 1907, doctor traced an outburst of thousands of cases of salmonella to a cook. They quarantined her for 2 years, tested her, confirmed, yeah, you're carrying salmonella. Stop cooking for people. But that's all she knew how to do for a living. So she got another job as a cook, killed 2 more people, and had to be quarantined for the rest of her life. Not everybody wants to be healthy, correct. Some people get paid to cook, to lie. That's who we have to stop. So what can we actually do about climate disinformation? First, especially here in the US, we can restore the guardrails that were preventing this in the first place, like overturned media fairness and consolidation laws, campaigns finance laws and regulations. Then we can start applying laws regulating mainstream media already to digital media. For example, payola was a big scandal back when people were paying radio stations to play a song to make it seem more popular. It's functionally the entire business model of the podcast industry now. So other than redoing some decades of bipartisan deregulation here in the US, what can we actually do as communicators about climate disinfo? Three big categories here: create consequences to make it clear that the disinfo is unpopular, discredit the disinfluencers so people don't fall for their lies no matter what they are, and ostracize the enablers whose work is used to facilitate the spread of disinformation, the PR companies, for example. You make it uncomfortable for professional liars to do their jobs, creating friction where you can to make it clear that climate policy is popular and denial and disinfo are for losers. Then you pass laws. Bad products get regulated. From local to international, there are policy solutions. So, person who asked about what cities can do, The Hague's fossil fuel ad ban is something that can be scaled up around the world. It's super popular, already been replicated in 3 other cities in the Netherlands, most recent one today. Had to update this presentation just now. Maybe your city can be next. EU's also got some great social media accountability laws, forcing big tech to provide some transparency. CAD Coalition is working with the UN and groups around the world to protect the public with a global initiative for information integrity. And here in the US, we can always sue the bastards. Litigation can be a powerful avenue for shutting off the disinfo tap. After all, the tobacco industry won tons of its cases before it started losing them. Then it got scared and settled. Now we don't have to see tobacco ads. Unfortunately, the disinfo ecosystem protects the industry from public accountability. That's the problem. Propaganda and disinformation are used to sever and supplant the connection between political opinion and political action. We must stop them and rebuild it. Because climate policy is popular, and if the situation were hopeless, they wouldn't be spending any of their profits on propaganda. I'm Philip Newell for the Climate Action Against Disinfo Coalition. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Phil. And in the interest of time, we're going to quickly move on to Cristina. So let me quickly introduce you. She's a principal analyst at Graphika, where she leads research into AI harms and examines social media information operations and networks of online influence for the company's Atlas platform. She's an expert on misinformation related to climate change and renewable energy in Spanish. And this is an example of where these kinds of disinformation campaigns are increasingly now going into non-English languages. So Cristina, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and hello, everyone. I am really glad to join you here. I'm a principal analyst at Graphika, and today I am going to cover some highlights of 2 public reports that we conducted with Green Latinos to understand how climate denialism circulates in Spanish language online spaces. First, I'm just going to walk you through some of the network analysis that we did for this. Then I'm going to talk about the most prominent narratives that we found in Spanish, and then a little bit about the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we observed these actors using to spread these narratives. I'm also going to cover key narratives that we found opposing renewable technologies, and then just lastly close out with the online dynamics that are used in the spread of these. So just really quickly, for those of you who haven't come across Graphika before, we are an open source intelligence firm that specializes on identifying threats stemming from social media. So not just on climate denialism, but a whole wide range of issues. And we're really proud to have been recognized for our expertise by industry experts and just some media outlets, especially on the 2 reports that I'm going to be discussing today. So the first thing we did for these reports was figure out the who, or the actors. We created a network map featuring the followers of X accounts that we had surfaced because they were using the most prominent Spanish language key terms related to the climate denialist conversation. Some of these are alarmismo climático, for example, climate alarmism. So these allowed us to capture these accounts and then get the followers of these accounts so that we were capturing the communities that were clearly showing an interest in climate denialist discourse. Because of time constraints, I'm not going to go in depth into the full network analysis of the map you see on the screen that is available in the public reports. So instead, let me give you some of the top lines. Contrary to the idea of a single coordinated climate denial machine, what we found in our analysis wasn't a standalone Spanish language network that is dedicated just solely to climate denialism. Instead, what we uncovered were these geographically distinct networks tied together by ideological affinity. And they were based in different places, from Spain to Latin America, Spanish-speaking countries, who were engaging with climate denialism intermittently, especially in response to events in their locality, like extreme weather or different climate policy announcements. So these are pretty stable communities because people just don't change who they're following overnight. So this suggests that this research, even though it's from 2022 and 2023, pretty much remains highly relevant. We identified several recurring narratives that kept surfacing across all of these communities in Spanish. So one thing to note is that some of these narratives are never necessarily isolated, and they tend to appear intertwined. They combine and mix to form a super narrative, or they might even serve as justification for one another. So you'll see what I mean with some examples. The first, the big one, is the idea that climate change is a hoax, or that it's just been exaggerated to serve different political ends. The second one was that climate change was just invented by global elites in order to gain power or gain wealth. The third one was mainly accusing Agenda 2030, or like the UN's global plan of action for sustainability, claiming that Agenda 2030 was just a globalist plot to undermine individuals' liberties, like to undermine everybody's ability to exercise their free will. Then the next one were just general targeted campaigns and attacks and harassment against scientists, activists, or policymakers, trying to frame them as alarmists or profiteers. Then we also saw the more conspiratorial claims that basically claiming that extreme weather is not caused by emissions, but by secret geoengineering, like chemtrails, for example. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how these actors were spreading these falsehoods. One of the tactics that we saw were recruitment posts. What that means is that you have a network of different influencers, and their main incentive is to gain followers or clout. And so in exchange for followership, they join an amplification network, which just means retweeting or amplifying the content of different influencers in exchange for their followership, and vice versa. So we definitely saw a concerted or intentional effort to grow this ecosystem of ideologically aligned influencers. The next thing is a little bit tied, because what networks of online communities need in order to stay alive is content. So what we saw was a translation of English language narratives into Spanish. Very few of these, or I would say like none of these, are necessarily original to Spanish language influencers. They came from other English speakers before them, or were published in English before, and then they were just adopted and translated into Spanish. So the work of climate skeptics like Michael Schellenberger or Bjorn Lomborg were some of the things that we saw in Spanish frequently cited or translated. And then we also saw efforts to evade content moderation. At the time we were doing this study was at the height of the COVID pandemic, so there was more of a content moderation effort and trust and safety effort in platforms that was taking place. And so some of the tactics that were being used to evade COVID content moderation were actually being adapted in the climate denialist discourse. And so we saw some use of coded language, which would involve alternate spellings of things related to climate science, or just intentional efforts to funnel audiences from like more moderated or more guarded platforms to less moderated platforms like Telegram or Rumble. So you would have a YouTube video that would say, tease some conspiratorial climate denialist discourse and say, but we can't tell you the whole thing here. Join our Telegram channel for the full scoop. So next I want to pivot to the adversarial narratives that we observed in Spanish targeting renewable technologies. The first one was a claim that land is deliberately being destroyed, either burned or cleared to build renewable projects like wind farms, for example. We also saw a lot of very viral misleading assertions that wind turbines harm animals, specifically whales. We also saw a claim that renewables only benefit elites and that they are just another form of profiteering. We saw claims about solar panels, claiming that solar panels pollute, and these claims were based on really distorted interpretations of actual problems, actual real issues related to waste disposal. And then we also saw that the claim that renewable energy is more costly and yet inherently unreliable. So this would happen during price hikes or, energy shortages that were more related to the invasion of Ukraine, but that some actors then claimed was actually to blame, renewable technologies were to blame for these price hikes. So these narratives were always a blend of environmental or economic fears, joined together with a little bit of anti-elite sentiment in order to just delegitimize climate action. So in the last minute that I have, I just want to really point out what online dynamics we observe, because these also apply to English language climate denialist discourse. And the main thing is that there is a correlation between the spikes of this type of content and real world events like heat waves or wildfires or legislation around renewables. So like we said before, many of these narratives never even originated in Spanish at all. They are translated, localized, and then reframed to fit different regional grievances. So I want to direct your attention to the graphic on screen because it tracks the volume of tweets that were featuring that false claim that forest fires are actually set intentionally to clear land for wind farms. And so in the yellow line is tracking the volume of this narrative in Spanish, and the blue line is tracking the volume of this narrative in English. And what it's showing is that spikes of these claims corresponded with large wildfires taking place around the world, with the language matching the affected geographical area. So what this is illustrating is that transnational information flow where conspiracy-driven narratives mutate and reappear across linguistic lines whenever they suit a local purpose. So in this particular case, the narrative is fitting a lot of purposes. First is minimizing the impact of man-made climate change on extreme weather events. So it's flattening all instances of wildfire to arson. And second, it is tying this arson to renewable technology. So you have in a single narrative, climate denialism and delegitimation of climate action, which is exploiting the very real and valid fears of communities that are slowly being approached by incoming wildfires. So just to close, these denialist and anti-renewable messages don't always dominate discourse, but they don't even have to, because by surfacing repeatedly in communities of ideological affinity and by strategically translating and reframing existing narratives, they just become the sort of ambient background noise. And this noise could very well be having negative effects on momentum in climate action or just undermining generally trust in scientific consensus. So understanding how these messages move and where they come from is really critical to anticipating the next wave of climate denialist discourse anywhere online. You can find more in-depth information about this talk in the reports that are cited in this slide. And thank you so much for your attention today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. Super useful and really groundbreaking in helping us track how these are moving across geography and language. Okay, so let's turn to Dr. Sander van der Linden. Sander's a professor of social psychology and society and the director of the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. And he's the author of Foolproof: Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity, which was just published a couple years ago, and I highly recommend it. So, Sander, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here along Phil and Christina and Tony. I agree with everything that's been said. There's tons of solutions out there. I'm just going to talk about one of them because that's what I know how to do, which is how to pre-bunk disinformation, and that's what I want to tell you about. Why am I showing you a slide of vaccines will change your DNA? Because actually, it's an interesting pivot to what Tony was saying about related narratives. So lots of people, when the new COVID vaccines came out, right, the new mRNA vaccines, new technology, a lot of fear mongering. But if you look at the history of propaganda, which is what I'm interested in a sort of larger propaganda techniques, if you trace this back to the first vaccine, which was, of course, Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine against smallpox, you can see artwork right here that people claim that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid with udders sprouting out of people's eyes and mouths. And so the first anti-vaccine activists in the 1800s were already talking about how vaccines are going to change your body. And so this trope that the vaccine is going to change your DNA is actually not new at all. It's just somehow we fail to anticipate these techniques over and over again. And that's why I want to talk about pre-bunking, because it's very similar with climate, right? They have the playbook, including propping up fake experts, casting doubt about scientific consensus, been well documented by the courts. And we know from tons of research on psychology that fact-checking and debunking is important, but you can't unring a bell, okay? It's so much harder to try to undo the damage when people have already integrated the misinformation into their mental model, into their social identities, that it's actually easier to try to prevent people from encoding misinformation in the first place, right? An ounce of prevention is a pound worth in cure. So what is inoculation or pre-bunking? So for those people who don't know, it actually follows the vaccine analogy exactly, right? So just as vaccines expose the body to a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, turns out you can do the same with the mind by preemptively exposing people, not to facts necessarily, but to a weakened dose of the types of misinformation and the types of techniques that are used to manipulate people in advance. And by refuting them in advance, you can help neutralize the impact of misinformation. People build up psychological antibodies, and you can measure those in people's resistance to disinformation, their ability to recognize it, how motivated they are. And so we've been doing a lot of research on this. Actually started with some work we did with Tony at the Yale Center around climate. And we started off with one of the biggest techniques, which was, of course, to spread doubt about climate science. Naomi Oreskes at Harvard has a great book and documentary on the emergence of doubt technique from tobacco to climate and now also COVID. It's the same technique. It's very hard to actually change people's minds with propaganda sometimes. So it's actually easier to cast doubt. And that's been the whole strategy. And so the question is, can you inoculate people from this technique, right? So we had 2,000 people come online. We tested them about their perception of the scientific consensus about climate change on a scale from 0 to 100% before as well as after. We told people, ironically, some misinformation about what the real purpose of the experiment is, so people wouldn't know what it's about. And of course, if you show people the actual scientific consensus about climate change, they update in the right direction, and people understand. I mean, if you look at some of the reports from YPCCC, 1 in 4 Americans, 25% still don't know what the actual magnitude of the scientific consensus is, specifically partly because of disinformation campaigns. But of course, we don't live in a world where people are just looking at the facts. This is not reality, right? So when you expose people to things like a fake petition, so this is the Global Warming Petition Project, which is a real website that faked the template of the National Academy of Sciences to make it seem as if there's a real petition. This is very old. This is from the 90s. But in 2016, some social media story went viral saying that climate scientists now say that climate change is a hoax. If you show that to people, right? It decreases their perceptions of scientific consensus. They're duped by it. If you do it side by side, which is what the media used to do, including the BBC up until, not too long ago, it's actually horrifying. That cancels out the power of facts completely. And you see that with vaccines too. You can have all the facts about vaccines, one story, one anecdote about a side effect, and boom, scientific consensus goes out the window. So that completely neutralizes the power of facts. But what about pre-bunking? So when you warn people in advance that there's political actors out there trying to manipulate them. That's the forewarning element of the inoculation. And then you actually preemptively refute this technique and say, look, they imitate official organizations, they use fake petitions, there's no verification process. People on this petition include Charles Darwin and Dr. Gary Halliwell from the Spice Girls. This thing is total bogus. You actually find that you can immunize people, not fully, right? You're not fully immunized, but if you compare this to the fact condition, you get about 2/3 immunity against this particular myth and technique, which is pretty good. And remarkably, it also worked for Republicans in this context. So Republicans did actually show more confirmation bias when they saw the misinformation, but the inoculation neutralized it, which was quite interesting, which was later replicated by John Cook and Steve Lewandowski, and a bunch of other people have replicated this. But then the question was, how do you move from something specific to something broader? And so we took some inspiration from Severus Snape. This is my ode to Alan Rickman, the actor, not so much J.K. Rowling, who said your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. So we actually created the first fake news game at the time, this years ago now. It's called Bad News. Bad News is actually a simulation of social media that exposes people to weakened doses of the more general techniques that are used to manipulate people online on climate and other topics. And it allows people to step into the shoes of a bad actor who's trying to exploit you, so that you can gain resistance to it by deconstructing their tactics. So here's Donald Trump. I'm back. Great idea, Joe. By executive order, I'm renaming Canada to North Dakota. Hashtag you got annexed. Well, not ironically, we came up with this joke 3 years ago. Unfortunately, it turned out not to be a joke. But there you go. So this is actually impersonating Donald Trump. You can see the Twitter handles manipulated. So your goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing any credibility. And most people actually don't notice the manipulation in a Twitter handle before, but once they're inoculated, once they go through the simulation of what we call impersonation of fake experts, fake organizations, they gain resistance. The mainstream media has a massive conspiracy. Here we have Elon Musk. Doge investigation confirms UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer was the inspiration for Mr. Darcy from hashtag Bridget Jones Diary. What else are the Brits hiding? This is part of our trolling inoculation, which Elon is the king of course. Stuff about climate, well, climate change, could have serious negative impact. Oh, let's attack that. How do you attack that, right? Total hoax, very polarizing. Science says climate will change, but can't even predict the rain, right? So you start floating these memes, and Kurt, who's an angry citizen, says, good point by the Cosmos Post, overconfident eggheads, climate hoax. And so, we inoculate people against polarization, impersonation, discrediting, emotional manipulation, trolling, conspiracy theories, right? Using these weakened dose, sarcastic, humorous examples. And then we test people. This is Johnson crude oil. Hey, Leo DiCaprio, it's snowing and freezing in New York. Could use some of that global warming you're always going on about. And so we asked people, how reliable is that, right? And then this thing went viral on the internet. So we had tens of thousands of people initially who participated. And here you see that for credible news, which is just factual and doesn't use manipulation, there's no change pre-post in the game. But for the techniques that use manipulation, people find them significantly less credible. They're also less willing to share it. And we've done dozens and dozens of studies on these games. John Cook has a game called Cranky Uncle, which is great as well. And then the last minute and a half that I have, I want to talk about the fact that not everyone wants to play a game. So we have millions of people who go through these gamified interventions to try to pre-bunk, but that's not enough because some people don't want to play a game. So initially, we partnered up with Google, who said, those annoying ads on YouTube that you can't skip? What if we put pre-bunk videos there, right? So the problem with your game is that we like inoculation, we want to help. This was back when they wanted to help. but it's opt-in. People have to come and be open-minded. So what if we just put it in the ad spaces? People can't skip it. Boom, hundreds of millions of people all at once. So we started creating these videos that pre-bunk in 30 to 60 seconds manipulation techniques. An example is a false dilemma. So the weakened dose is something fairly innocuous. So I don't know if people are into Star Wars, but this is from Revenge of the Sith. So here Anakin Skywalker is talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he says, "If you're not with me, then you're my enemy." And then Obi-Wan says, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes." And then the narrator goes, "Don't use false dilemmas, don't join the dark side, be immune to these tactics." And then we bombard people with, false dilemmas from social media, as well as things like ad hominem attack on climate scientists, incoherence, emotional manipulation, things like scientists lie and say they can accurately measure global temperatures. What they won't tell you is that global warming has stopped almost completely in the last 20 years. But how do you know that if you can't measure global temperatures, right? Incoherence, which is a hallmark of conspiratorial thinking. If you look at the data, a lot going on here, but basically, people find this stuff less trustworthy. They're more confident in their abilities and less willing to share it. It took us a year to actually do this on YouTube. So we got permission from YouTube. They were actually in the ad spaces. We had millions of people in this campaign. People were pinged within 24 hours of seeing our ad or a control ad on YouTube, and they did a test. And then we found in the field, it boosted people by about 5 to 10%. That's much smaller than in the lab. But for a brand lift survey, which is what they call it, kind of brand recognition, which is usually what they use it for, that's kind of a big number compared to what companies pay for in terms of brand recognition, right? Often just 2%. We're now moving to rolling out this method on Instagram, which has a built-in quiz. So we can do big Instagram campaigns, try to pre-bunk this nonsense using influencers. And we have a free website, inoculation.science. You can find all of our games, all of our resources, handbooks for free. Happy to talk more about this, but I'm out of time. But Biden actually used a template from our climate study to pre-bunk the invasion of Putin into Ukraine, which threw Putin off, and he had to plan another invasion, which is perhaps the most real-world example that I've seen of inoculation put to good use. Thanks very much. Happy to discuss.
Great. Well, thank you, Sander. And since you're on up front, I'm going to go straight to you first. So a lot of what people deal with when they're dealing with misinformation are specific false claims. There is no scientific consensus, or volcanoes cause climate change, or whatever. So could you help our audience understand the difference between fact-based solutions? So how do you, in other words, countering the false claim itself, which is what I think most people intuitively feel like that's what they need to do, is like, well, no, here's all the reasons why we know that volcanoes don't cause climate change. So that's one particular strategy, but it's been often called kind of a whack-a-mole strategy because there are 1,000 of those and they keep coming back and keep coming back. And so you just you bang it down and then it pops up somewhere else. And then another approach has been the logic-based one, which you're kind of alluding to, I think, with some of your techniques. So could you just quickly kind of distinguish between those two different solutions?
Yeah. So I think there's a huge trade-off here in terms of depth versus breadth, right? So initially we started off with a very specific myth, like the scientific consensus on climate change. And what you get then is actually very high immunity against a specific myth, right? So you tell people in advance, this is the tricks that they're going to use to confuse you on the scientific consensus. Here, we can arm people with the facts and counter evidence and so on. And then you attack them with the scientific consensus misinformation. And then people are relatively immune to that specific type of misinformation, right? That's a kind of a fact-based or an issue-based inoculation, which does have its place sometimes. So Twitter, before Elon Musk, adopted some of the pre-bunking work, and they send a message during the 2016 election to the top of people's feeds saying you're going to see election misinformation this cycle, particularly that voting by mail is not safe. That's a specific myth. And they pre-bunked that myth for millions of American voters, right? And so that's issue-based inoculation. But then people say, what about other election myths? What about other climate myths, right? And so you can have high efficacy on one, but it doesn't scale, right? There's no breadth. So another approach is logic or technique-based inoculation, which is where you try to scale it up. So in the game, for example, we went from scientific consensus, right, to fake experts, to impersonation. So impersonation can be anything. You could be a fake expert, you could impersonate a celebrity, an organization. So now it's become a general technique, right? Same with conspiracy theories. Like in the game, we talk about the building blocks of almost all conspiracy theories. Nefarious intent, somebody's hiding something, plotting in secret somewhere, right? The general building blocks. Instead of a specific conspiracy theory, like 15-minute cities are going to cause, global lockdowns or something like that. And the test, of course, is when you do the general one, does it work when you then bombard people with lots of specific examples of that technique? And so generally what inoculation finds is that yes, but the effect sizes are lower, right? Because you're covering a wider field, so you're generating broader spectrum immunity against a whole range of conspiracies, but the specific immunity against any single one you can't guarantee, right? So it's a depth versus breadth sort of trade-off. But most people like the technique or the broader scale one because A, it's more apolitical. You're talking about general techniques without having to resort to specific issues, and two, it scales better.
Super. Thank you. Okay, so another set of questions that we're getting, and this is for everybody, is there's, of course, the specific false claim, like how do we protect from and respond to specific false claims? But of course, there's a larger system here. So what are the system level solutions to mis and disinformation? Policies by social media companies or by national governments or education systems. How can we change the system that can help minimize the creation and spread of mis and disinformation?
So I had mentioned it rather briefly in my admittedly very quick run through. Apologies, everybody. That is trimmed down from a 45-minute presentation. I did my best. So fossil fuel ad bans, I think, are a great example. They're based on something tried and true, the tobacco ad bans. It's funny that the fossil fuel industry picked up the tobacco industry playbook for disinfo because, of course, like, tobacco industry lost. Like, I don't understand. It took them decades, and that's what it's effectively done, is buy the industry these extra decades and decades and billions of dollars of profits. But those kind of policy solutions, banning the fossil fuel ads, as I said, is sort of a growing local city-based kind of solution that I think is also helpful in sort of taking back the public sphere from advertisers, from marketing, from the constant sort of deluge of the powerful and the rich being able to force their messages on you. And then, like I said, in the US, re-erecting some of the barriers that come down. Things like media consolidation used to be that the same one person couldn't own a newspaper and a radio station and a TV station in the same little area, because obviously that would give them an inordinate amount of power to shape the information environment for that geography. Obviously now, Rupert Murdoch has done that internationally, and hedge fund managers steeped in fossil fuels like Paul Marshall are doing it with GB News in the UK. So it's tricky, but those laws have existed before, and so bringing them back is, I think, a starting place. And then, as I mentioned, litigation, the recent ruling of a German energy company in Peru sort of established the precedent that yes, fossil fuel companies can be held accountable for their damages. And so those sort of system scale reactions and policies that can constrain bad actors and make them act in a more legally and public friendly way.
Okay, and Cristina, do you have thoughts on that too?
We at Graphika are not necessarily like in the communications expertise space. So what we deal with is online communities. And from the perspective of online communities, one of the things that we have seen some evidence of is that people tend to believe what the communities online that they're surrounded by believe, because then content is a signal, and that signals to your community that you're a part of it, and signals that you are not part of the adversarial community. So one of the things in terms of systems is figure out and map out what different online landscapes in different platforms look like. Get to know those communities and understand what it is other than ideological affinity or geography that is tying them together. Otherwise, it is very hard to get your message to resonate within an adversarial community and vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point of that, those of us who are older still operate in a worldview where there are sources of information that broadcast them out. So, Fox News might be one example of that. You could take any major media company as an example. But of course, increasingly, because of the internet and because of social media, you get these much smaller and much more tightly bound together discourse communities. And so how do you engage with those folks to help address their perhaps very different bases or motivations to share misinformation or to be influenced by misinformation? So it's just become a much more fragmented landscape than ever before. And yet, it's many of the same techniques, it's many of the same false claims, and it's often in service of the same goals. Okay, it's just now fragmented into many, many smaller and smaller conversations. Okay, so a big question that's on everybody's mind these days, because this is a dynamic and fast-changing environment, is the emerging challenges of AI-driven mis and disinformation and online bots. So one just open question of what are you seeing in terms of the generation of misinformation by using AI? But also on the flip side, how can AI be used to help combat mis and disinformation? Anyone want to take a first stab at that?
I mean, I guess I can, having monitored 4chan and other spaces like this. I have seen lots of AI-generated images and text that would make your skin crawl. So it is certainly being used for all sorts of engagement building in these audiences where, for example, because there is no evidence that offshore wind turbines hurt whales, they will instead use a AI-generated image of wind turbines with dead whales next to them. So some of it's just that kind of basic providing more visceral imagery for otherwise boring blog posts. And some of it is just seeing some reporting yesterday out of Canada of a group that set up AI bots to send letters to local councillors full of disinfo saying like, I'm a whatever, and I think you should not do this. And so what it's done, and Imran Ahmed of CCDH has called it sort of reduced the marginal cost of creating disinfo down to zero. So instead of one person having to actually write the myths and then post them, they can have an AI bot do it sort of at scale. The other side, though, is that like AI bots don't vote. So like when it comes to sort of rubber hits the road, bots are only as good as sort of the inflating perception of popularity. It's not real power. And then, yes, when you go on Reddit to the Change My View subreddit, where people go because they want their views to be changed, and you have an AI bot lie to people, yes, it can be very convincing if you go to a venue where people want their minds to be changed. I am dim on AI, if you can't tell.
We did an article actually yesterday on AI slop, including some of the Reddit stuff, which is now labeled the sort of the enshittification of the internet. So there's so much AI generated crap that people are drowning in it. Some of it for entertainment, some of it for engagement bait. And so I think that's really interesting. But the what you see is then the AI models are then also subsequently trained on all of this crap. And so it becomes like a bad loop. But in terms of disinformation, I would second what Phil said. The cost now is, the barriers to entry are none. Anyone can create climate disinfo, micro-target people, and do it at scale. Before you have to have people, pilot test and draft hundreds of variations on a message. Now AI can do that in a matter of seconds, and research has shown that AI powered micro-targeting is a real risk. But on the flip side, there's also all of this research that shows that conversations with chatbots can change people's minds. I was a little skeptical about this at first, but there's a paper on climate now that shows that when people engage with chatbots, they're more likely to change their mind on climate conspiracies. There's been one on vaccines. There's one that we're doing about misperceptions around the climate impacts of different behaviors. And it's sort of, why are people changing their mind when they're talking to a chatbot? We did some research on these bridging attributes. So what, kind of alignment. What do people want from the bot? And it's interesting. People say they don't want validation. They don't want empathy. They want facts and evidence. And it's interesting that that is also the mechanism that a lot of these papers claim is what's happening, is that people perceive the AI as not having an agenda, being unbiased, unintentional, just providing facts and evidence. And it's kind of surprising that people then go on and just update their beliefs, and longitudinally too, not just in the experiment, but over time. And then unfortunately, some people seem to develop relationships with AI bots that go off the rails, but that's another topic.
Yeah. So I think it's important as context just to keep in mind that most people don't know much about most things, and that's including climate change. And as a result, most people are starting from a position where they just don't know that much about the issue. And as a result, that makes them more vulnerable to misinformation when they encounter it. But it also means they're more open to the truth when they encounter it. And so that's really, I think, one of the deepest underlying stories here is that, in a sense, the climate community, which is beholden to the facts and the truth as established through empirical data and science, is in a race with the disinformers. Okay. And so you've got to recognize that's kind of at the root level is what's going on with many, many people. And then, Sandra, to your point, that really gets to our perceptions of what these computers are. And I think in many people's current perception of these models is that they somehow think of them as neutral. Of course, they are trained on human data, so they are not neutral. They reflect our biases because we are flawed. We are biased, right? And yet people have that perception that it's not a human being that's trying to manipulate me. But that then also underscores Sanders' point, is that when you help people understand that there are people out there trying to manipulate your beliefs, that in and of itself can help provide some inoculation against the influence of those techniques, especially when you're taught just a little bit about how to recognize those techniques before you encounter them in the wild. Okay, so we got just a couple minutes left, so let's turn to one last question for all of you. And it's a very popular question, is what resources and tools are available to help individuals and organizations counter misinformation? Are there particular tools or research that you would recommend to our audience?
Debunking Handbook. It's on the Skeptical Science website. It's translated into a ton of languages. It incorporates the inoculation that Sanders talked about. And it provides a structure for debunkings of fact, myth, fallacy, fact that has been sort of my go-to for the past decade plus. So that's my one answer, is the Debunking Handbook.
Cristina?
I think, and to piggyback on the last question, regardless of how we feel about AI generated content, it is already out there. Like, genie's out of the bottle, it's already changing lives. And one of the things I would say, it's also a tool that you can use to your advantage. And we saw that translation is really effective for denialist discourse, and you can use it to your advantage to reach more communities that have a desert of content, and that void is already being filled with low quality information. You can use to your advantage tools that translate very accurately and make accessibility, like they lower the barriers of accessibility and bring information that matters to these communities. One of the things is that this type of content still needs vectors of distribution. You still need a community that establishes these parasocial relationships that are what actually breeds trust. And you still need trust for that information to matter. So the offline work of creating community and reaching out to people and engendering trust still has to be done. But now you have a tool that you can use to your advantage. And if you use it more effectively than the discursive adversarial you might have a fighting chance.
Thank you. And Sandra, quick recommendation from you.
Yeah, so we have the website inoculation.science. It hosts all of the videos we've produced, all of the games, all of the handbooks, the debunking handbook, the pre-bunking handbook, and that is specifically because we get all these questions all the time about this myth and that technique and how do you do this, how do you do that. It's a step-by-step guide that breaks it down for organizations. How can you do this on your own in the wild using validated techniques and evidence? But to Christina's point. There were 12 members of U.S. Congress that visited Cambridge in the UK recently, and I was asked to talk to them about disinformation. I was a bit nervous about that. But being in Cambridge, there wasn't going to be any ICE police detaining me. So there was one Republican congressman from Kentucky actually who asked a question, and we had a really good conversation actually. So he asked me about Biden's COVID and the censorship and so on. And but he said, I've been affected by misinformation. There's misinformation that I own $14 million, and my wife keeps asking me where that money went, and it's really annoying. And so like we use that on a personal level, he could understand the harm of misinformation, but then he was worried about censorship. And so we talked about how fact-checking is not censorship, how moderation is not censorship, right? Freedom of speech, not freedom of reach. And in the end, we agree misinformation is real. It's a problem. We need to do something about it, but we aren't going to censor anyone. And I felt like in that moment that there was a weird progress. Maybe it was just being a politician, but there was some bridging divides on when you start out and these sort of ends. And there isn't a handbook that tells you how to do that, but just keep having conversations, I think, is the important part.
Thank you, Senator. It's a perfect note to end on. Eric, back to you.
Thank you, Tony, for moderating the conversation, and Phil, Christina, and Sander for sharing your research on climate dis and misinformation. We will send everyone a follow-up email after this event with the recording and information on the next event of our speaker series. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks so much.